Hello, church history friends. I'm Barb Walden, and it is a joy to welcome you to the second lecture in our fall lecture series. Thank you for joining us this evening as we welcome John Dinger and hear all about the fascinating story of William Marks. Now, joining me today is my co-host, Peter Smith. Peter is taking care of all the behind the scenes magic like he does every week, and we so appreciate him. Peter also serves as a board member for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation and as the co-host of our Historic Sites bus tours. So welcome, Peter. And in addition to Peter, it's a joy to introduce Lexi Frazier. Lexi is a former student in the Alma Blair internship program and is coming up to us tonight from Kirtland, Ohio. So welcome, Lexi. This lecture series is not only a great way to learn a little bit of church history, it's also an opportunity to help support preserving church heritage. Donations received during the lecture series will go to developing new educational programs. It helps fund the Alma Blair internship program, a life-changing program. And it continues our ongoing support for the maintenance and preservation of all 5 Community of Christ historic sites. Lexi will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat. Thank you all for your consideration and thank you for your generous support. Now, joining us tonight is our guest speaker, John Dinger. John is an independent historian living in Idaho. He's published a variety of articles and books related to Mormon history. John and his co-author Cheryl Bruno have also written a new biography on William Marks, which should be published soon, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. We have been really dying to learn more about William Marks and his story. So welcome, John, and thank you for joining us today and giving us a little sneak peek on what we can anticipate in your biography. I'll turn things over to you as we're all eager to learn a little bit more about William Marks and his story.
Thank you. And again, I'm so honored to be here today. It's such an exciting thing for me. So on the evening of March 12th, 1835, at a meeting of the newly created 12 apostles, Joseph Smith proposed a mission for them in the eastern states, holding conferences along the way. And it was decided that the apostles, as a traveling high council, would leave Kirtland on Monday, May 4th, 1835, and visit several New York branches of the church. When the 12 reached Freedom, New York on May 22nd, 1835, they organized the Freedom Conference, which included the branches in New York. The presiding elder, Warren Cowdery, reported 65 members in good fellowship in the Freedom branch. 43-year-old William Marks, a member of the Portage branch, was in attendance at this conference. Having been associated with the church for some months, he had already attained the office of priest and seemed to be held in high regard as he reported on behalf of the 3 branches. So the Monday after the conference at Freedom concluded, a large company consisting of William Marks and 8 of the 12 traveled the 21 miles east and arrived that evening at the Marks home. The company stayed for 2 days before departing for the rest of their circuit. No record of the events of these 2 days exist, but it was not insignificant that Marks was spending time with leaders of the new church who had associated with Joseph Smith. His mature age, prosperity, reliable leadership, and social connections would propel him quickly to leadership positions in the fledgling church. So William Marks was born on November 15th, 1792 in Rutledge County, Vermont. He married Rosanna Robinson on May 2nd, 1813, and they had 9 children between the years of 1814 and 1832. William and Rosanna joined the Latter-day Saints at some point in the 6 months between May 20th and November 3rd, 1834. The Marks family moved to Kirtland by April 1837 during the time of heated dissent and apostasy. As Joseph Smith began to withdraw from many of his Kirtland enterprises, he surprisingly transferred his financial interests to this newcomer, William Marks. In April 1837, Joseph Smith named Marks proprietor of the Kirtland printing office, previously owned by Smith and Sidney Rigdon, And on April 10th, 1837, Joseph and Emma conveyed the Kirtland Temple property to William Marks for a consideration of $500. It's not clear why Joseph Smith and other church leaders chose William Marks to transfer their interests to. Marks had been a member of the church for 3 years, an elder for 1, and had not completed traveling missionary service. He had just arrived in Kirtland and had seemingly only had passing contact with Joseph Smith. However, he was loyal, and he may have seemed more stable than many of the other Kirtland saints. He was a man of means and was competent in business and in also managing people. He was also called as a spiritual leader to the people. At a conference held on September 3rd, 1837 in Kirtland, the church surveyed its losses. Several men on the High Council and traveling High Council, or the apostles, had been removed. William Marks was one of the men chosen to fill the vacancy on the High Council. And then on September 17th, 2 weeks later, at an assembly at the Kirtland Temple, Newell K. Whitney nominated William Marks to officiate as agent to the bishop, to transact business of the bishop at Kirtland, transact the business of the bishop in Kirtland in Whitney's absence. So although Marks, at age 44, was a seasoned man, he was still new to church service and not readily distinguished from the other members of the High Council. However, the nomination was unanimously approved. Marks rose and said that he would comply with the request of the church, and the Lord being his helper, he would discharge the duties thereof to the best of his abilities. Marks was called upon to help liquidate Kirtland and help the saints leave for Missouri. So by April of 1839, most saints were gathering to Commerce, later known as Nauvoo. In 1839, at the May General Conference of the church held in Quincy, Illinois, it was resolved that, quote, Elder William Marks be hereby appointed to preside over the church at Commerce, Illinois. So for the first few years, Nauvoo lacked a civil government with elected officials. Rather, it was the High Council with William Marks as its head, which met for the first time after being formed on October 20th, 1839, who ran the civil affairs of Nauvoo. So for the last few months of 1839, Marks and the High Council started to fashion a real city and set it up as an orderly and organized manner. So in 1840, Marks continued in his role as a city leader and had to deal with the lack of a court system. In 1840, a majority of Marks and the High Council's time was taken through the investigation and prosecution of trials for crimes committed in Nauvoo. Specifically, he presided over 6 cases of slander, 2 cases of theft, a case of perjury, and a civil debt case. In December of 1840, while the High Council was helping run the city, legislators ratified Nauvoo's enabling charter. So with this, Nauvoo was able to elect a mayor, city councilman, and alderman, and start to govern itself by civil law. On February 1st, 1841, an election was held, and William Marks was elected as an alderman, a very powerful position. An alderman held a municipal rank immediately below the mayor, doubling as both justice of the peace and adjudicator in the city court. So absent the mayor, an alderman could fill in as chief justice of the municipal court. So Marks' most important role and powerful role in Nauvoo was that of the state president. At the time he was appointed, he was the head of the Nauvoo church, only subject to the First Presidency, and in this role, he was to, quote, govern members, arbitrate disputes, investigate misconduct, and oversee the ecclesiastical and religious life of Mormons within the stake boundaries, close quote. So Marks, as the president of the Nauvoo stake, was second to the First Presidency in power. For example, at the 1841 General Conference, certain members with leadership positions were objected to for various reasons. One of these members was John E. Page, a member of the 12 Apostles, who had written certain abusive letters incriminating certain individuals wrongfully. So even though Page was a member of the 12 Apostles, he was brought before Marks and the High Council to approve or disapprove his continued role in that calling. So Marks and the High Council, after his case had been spoken on at considerable length, decided unanimously that he should continue in his calling as one of the 12 apostles. So this really shows the power that Marx held. However, once Hiram and Joseph were murdered at Carthage, things changed for Marx. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Marx was still trusted. Emma Smith pushed for Marx's ascension as leader of the church. She needed someone whom she could trust that would help her in her financial situation and also oppose polygamy, and William Marx fit these requirements. The later distrust of Marx by others in Nauvoo likely was due to that anti-polygamy stance. As early as July of 1844, people started to wonder who would lead the church as many different claimants stepped forward. While Marx never claimed that he should be the leader, he played one of the major roles in this succession crisis. So while Marx is not usually brought up today when discussing who would be a successor, he was initially one of the most likely options. The following year, in April of 1845, Emma told James Monroe, her children's school teacher, her views on Marx, who she thought should be the leader of the church. Monroe recorded, "My time has not been spent wholly without profit, as it has been occupied chiefly in conversing with Aunt Emma, from whom I have obtained several new and interesting ideas concerning the organization and government of the church. The next officer," here he's referring to the one to take over, "the next officer is the president of the High Council in line, and not one of his counselors, any more than the Secretary of State or of the Treasury would be a successor to the president. It is not the 12, because they have authority only among the branches in the world, and their peculiar provision is to spread the gospel among all nations of the earth. The High Council have all power, as it follows that on removal of the first president, the office would devolve upon the president of the High Council in Zion." So as discussions about succession were going on, Sidney Rigdon, the surviving member of the First Presidency, returned from Pittsburgh. Immediately after the martyrdom, Marx saw Rigdon as the possible legal successor to Joseph Smith. Rigdon claimed that he was the proper guardian of the church, and Marx called for a meeting. On the 6th of August, W. Phelps also tried to stall until the members of the 12 apostles returned. Phelps did not have to wait long, as Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Lyman White, Orson Pratt, and Wilford Woodruff all returned to Nauvoo that same night. So on August 8, 1844, a meeting was held at the request of William Marx, in which both Rigdon and Young spoke. The majority of the attendees favored Young over Rigdon. And so after this decision was made, Young told the crowd, quote, "The next is President Marx. Our feelings are to let him stand as president of the stake as heretofore." So whether this was a heartfelt expression or an implied threat, Brigham Young made clear with this statement that Marx was serving at the pleasure of the 12 apostles and not the other way around. Starting in September 1844, those supporting Young started the effort to undermine and minimize Marx's influence in the church. On September 8, 1844, Sidney Rigdon was cut off by the High Council in a public meeting. While there is some confusion as to what body cut off Rigdon, even being described as a court of a most anomalous character, it was the High Council. The Times and Seasons on September 15, 1844, quoted Brigham Young saying, quote, "It is written in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants that the president of the church can be tried before the High Council of the church. We have here before us this morning the High Council, and we will try Sidney Rigdon before this council and let them take an action on his case this morning." Brigham Young added that the 12 are to be regarded as witnesses in this trial and not judges. So thus, in a sense, Brigham Young was acting as the prosecutor. While the meeting was conducted under unusual circumstances, William Marx made sure that it was carried out according to High Council rules and thus legal. President Marx followed High Council protocol by personally offering a defense of the accused. "I will take up the opposite side," he said, both because he, quote, "had always been a friend to Elder Rigdon, and because, according to Revelation, someone from the High Council was to stand up in behalf of the accused." Marx's defense of Rigdon ensured that the trial followed the rules by which the High Council operated and made this excommunication legal. But Marks must have known that to defend Rigdon in a public meeting would put him more at odds with the 12 than he had been at that point. Even when Marks stated, quote, "I have had a long acquaintance with Brother Sidney, and if the congregation feels to sever him from the body, I am willing to go by the majority of the church." But that statement was not enough for the 12. After Rigdon was cut off, quote, "It was moved and seconded that we get an expression from Brother Marks if he is in approval of this day's proceedings." Marks arose and said that he was willing to be satisfied with the action of the church on this case. However, this expression was not enough. At a later High Council meeting, the faith, principle, and pursuit of Elder William Marks was called up. When it was found that he imbibed a notion different from the apostles or council, and was thus voted that the council in future do business without him at their head. So the High Council expelled Marks. However, they could neither excommunicate him nor take away his presidency, as they had no authority to do either. They simply removed him from the High Council in order that they could conduct business without him. The following month at the church's general conference, Marks was again discussed by leaders. The discussion started when President John Smith moved that William Marks be sustained in his calling as president of the stake. This was objected to by W.W. Phelps, relying as his reason on the High Council's expulsion of Marks. Brigham Young gave his view, quote, "that a president of a stake could be dropped without taking his standing from him in the church, but not so with the First Presidency or the 12. A president of a stake is only called for time being. If you drop him, he will fall back into the high priest's quorum." Young's statement gave the group the authority to drop Marks by distinguishing the role of stake president from that of the First Presidency or the 12 apostles. So with this, Young made the stake presidency a temporary calling that could be taken without excommunication. After Young's explanation, the motion made by President John Smith was put forward, but there were only 2 votes. It's unknown who the 2 were that wanted Marks to retain his position as stake president, but a contrary vote was put and carried by an overwhelming majority. So Marks was no longer Nauvoo stake president in the eyes of Young and had no place in Young's hierarchy after the October conference. Starting in February of 1845, Marks' presence in Nauvoo became dangerous as physical violence started to be used against his household. At that time, Marks was running the Nauvoo house as a business. On February 12th, Hosea Stout, a Nauvoo policeman, recorded, "A man named John C. Elliott, who had been engaged in the murder of Joseph and Hiram, came into town and put up with William Marks. Stout claimed, however, that Marks was not just putting the man up in his hotel, but Marks did all he could to secrete him. And, quote, William Marks used all his influence to notify the mob and raise an excitement against us," close quote. Stout's claim that Marks was allying himself with the murderers was false. Elliott was arrested and brought to trial before the municipal court in Nauvoo. And rather than being secreted by Marks, testimony showed that he had been lounging about our city for a time past on pretense of legal business. So shortly thereafter, an attack was made on the Marks household. Both William Clayton and Joseph III recounted the incident. Joseph III recounted, "Brother Marks was an object of suspicion apparently, and his household was subjected to surveillance. Among the indignities perpetrated, watchmen were set over the premise where President Marks was living. This Washington Peck, a man who was staying with the Marks, made himself obnoxious to the dominant party by taking part with President Marks and by rather actively objecting to some things that were transpiring. And one evening he was beset as he was going home, and his clothing was smeared with human ordure by 2 or 3 who beset him in the darkness." Joseph III also recounted that this was not the only attack on an associate of William Marks. He also recalled, "There were 2 young unmarried men, one by the name of Charles Smith and the other by the name of Kendall, Amos, I think, who were friends to the Marks family and who were frequent visitors at their house. These came under suspicion, and Charlie Smith was attacked one night when coming to our house by the guard who was stationed in the yard." And so these acts of violence were enough for Marks to finally move his family out of Nauvoo. In late February, he left Nauvoo suddenly, moving to Fulton City, Illinois, a small town 140 miles north of Nauvoo. So after Marks left Nauvoo, he first settled in Fulton, Illinois. While he did not live there long, he did like it enough to help convince Emma Smith and her family to move to Fulton. This move likely occurred in September of 1845, and they lived a quarter of a mile from the Marks family. It was in Fulton that Marks first became associated with James Strang. Joseph III wrote that while they were living in Fulton, Elder William Marks received a visit from James J. Strang. Joseph III saw him at the home of Marks, where there was to be an evening meeting, likely a time for Strang to put forth his claims and try to convert both the Marks and Smith family. Shortly thereafter, both families left Fulton. The Smith family moved back to Nauvoo, and the Marks family moved to Shabbona Grove, Illinois. On December 28, 1845, Aaron Smith, a Strangite missionary on his way to Nauvoo, wrote, "From St. Charles, we started towards Shabbona Grove, intending to visit President William Marks, late president of the stake at Nauvoo." As Strangite missionaries were trying to convince Marks of the truthfulness of their message, he was also becoming a leading figure in Shabbona Grove. In the spring of 1846, the city elections were held in his home, and he was elected Justice of the Peace. 1 month after being elected a Judge of Men, he was appointed to be a judge in Israel by the Strangites. At their general conference on April 6, 1846, William Marks was appointed and ordained bishop of the church. So Marks traveled to Voorhee, Wisconsin to attend the general conference when he was appointed bishop, and it was clear that he had accepted the claims of James Strang. Marks was an important figure at this conference, as whenever President Strang left the chair, William Marks was the president pro tem of the high priests, and he assumed it as he was next in order. On April 7th, he participated in the excommunication of Brigham Young and many of the 12 apostles as one of the voting members of the newly formed Strangite High Council. With his participation in this trial, Marks made clear that he did not believe in or support the Brigham Young-led church and had found a new religious home with the Strangites. However, almost immediately after this conference, Marks' participation with the Strangites started to wane. While Marks never explained this, the historical record shows that his lack of activity directly corresponds to the time John C. Bennett joined with the Strangites. 2 weeks after Bennett joined with the new church, another conference was held at Voorhee on July 20th, 1846. Marks was not in attendance, and it was likely that he resigned all his positions at this time. By April 1847, Marks started to re-engage with the Strangites. At their annual general conference, William Marks opened the second day with prayer. And while Marks had a great dislike for John C. Bennett in the past, it appeared he was willing to work with him for the good of the kingdom of God. While Marks would attend Strangite conferences, he did not relocate to Voorhee, Wisconsin. By early 1848, Marks again, his interest with the Strangites started to wane. On April 4th, 1848, Isaac Scott wrote to William E. McClellan and said, "William Marks has left Strangism, but still Strang seems determined to make some capital out of his ism before it is numbered with the things that were." Marks did appear in Voorhee in August of 1849 and humbly asked the assembled church for forgiveness. Those present rejoiced with joy unspeakable to see an old saint coming back. So prior to this conference, and unknown to Marks at the time, Strang had also entered into polygamy when he married a second wife on July 13th, 1849. However, by the summer of 1850, news of Strang's second marriage was common knowledge to the saints living in Voorhee. Marks did not appear at another conference again. After leaving Strang, Marks joined with Charles B. Thompson. And like Strang, Thompson attracted many individuals that would later play a role in the reorganized church, such as William Marks, James Adams, James Blakesley, and Josiah Ells. So on April 15th, 1852, Thompson had enough followers to hold a meeting known as a solemn assembly with Marks in attendance. Days later, Thompson wrote to his church, singling out the importance of William Marks as one of his adherents. In describing Marks to his congregant, he wrote, He was appointed president of Nauvoo stake when it was first organized on the 5th of October, 1839, and continued in that office until after Joseph's death. On the 7th of October, 1844, he was superseded in his office by John Smith because he boldly protested against the usurpation and corruption of the 12. While Marks was certainly welcome because of his talents and ability, he was also being used to lend legitimacy to Thompson's group, just as Strang had used him. The fact that Marks joined this group and was writing for the church's paper signaled to other non-polygamous saints that Thompson had credibility. However, Marks did not join Thompson with the same enthusiasm as he did with the Mormons or Strangites. Just a week after the Solemn Assembly, he wrote a friend and later member of the reorganization, James M. Adams, in describing the assembly in his conversation, he wrote, "I arrived there on that day with but little understanding of the work and about as much faith, for I have been so often disappointed that I had become fearful and unbelieving, and with a determination to be very inquisitive, for I have learned from experience that it is a very easy thing to be deceived." Regardless, Mark started working on the committee regarding the gathering of the new church. He noted in a letter to Thompson, "I have been so busy in preparing for the discharge of the duties of the committee that I have not spent any time to instruct others." Mark's leading the committee to find a location for the gathering was odd, considering his past objections to gathering and his unwillingness to gather with the Strangites. The year 1853 was Mark's last full year with Thompson. In June of 1853, Marks wrote a letter to the church, which is his most oft-quoted writing. He claimed that Smith repented and changed his views on polygamy. Joseph, however, quoting Marks here, Joseph, however, became convinced before his death. I met him one morning in the street, and he said to me, "Brother Marks, I have something to communicate to you." We retired to a by-place and sat down together. When he said, "We are a ruined people," I asked how so. He said, "This doctrine of polygamy or spiritual wife system that has been taught and practiced among us will prove our destruction and overthrow. I have been deceived." The following spring, the Thompsonians held their solemn assembly on April 15, 1853 in Canesville. At that point, some 20 families had gathered at this place. The Zion's Harbinger, their newspaper, recorded that a few days after the solemn assembly, Marks visited the members and told some that he was going to move to Canesville, and he was making arrangements to build all the necessary buildings for the use of his family. However, in a private letter to Adams, Marks told a very different story. He told Adams that he did visit Canesville and found, quote, that there was a great many that were quite dissatisfied, principally with the time tithing. Marks spent about 10 to 12 days there and concluded, "I came to the conclusion that there was the greatest oppression that I ever saw imposed upon a community." Because of what he saw, he decided that he would not gather with the church as, quote, "I was satisfied that many would leave." By June of 1855, Marks had left Charles B. Thompson's church. Again, writing to James Adams, he stated, "I came to the conclusion in the forepart of last winter to reject all organizations." He then described his time with Thompson and others as false pretension and false prophets and foolery that has been going on for the last 10 or 12 years. So referring to Thompson and others, he wrote, "I have long been wandering in darkness and following false prophets until I had become tiresome and weary." After Mark's rejection of Young, Strang, and Thompson's organizations, he decided that he would teach the first principles of the gospel and baptism for the remission of sins and the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost. While not officially joining with anyone, he did note that there is quite a number in this region that shared his views. Specifically, he noted that John E. Page is one. However, Marks was very skeptical of anyone and noted, "We are living in a day when the devil has great power, and it appears from what we see and hear and read that he will, if possible, deceive the whole world. Therefore, it is highly necessary that we are watchful and prayerful that we may not be deceived." The following year, in 1856, Mark started meeting more formally with W. W. Blair, John E. Page, and John Gaylor. and these men agreed to call a conference and organize. The point of the conference was to, quote, meet and discuss the subject and try to get a starting point, and not complete an organization then, but try to come into union and concentrate of faith and strength, close quote. This group of believers continued to meet, and many joined their ranks, including Edmund Briggs, Israel Rogers, and James Blakesley, who later became leaders in the reorganized church. So Marks officially joined with the reorganization when he was baptized on June 11th, 1859 at Amboy, Illinois. At the time Marks joined the reorganization, the Utah Saints were starting to rewrite Marks' history. In a discourse given by Heber C. Kimball in 1859, he stated, "If William Law, William Marks, and hundreds of others had known Joseph was a prophet, they would not have betrayed him, not tried to take away his life." So this marked a shift from merely considering Marks an apostate to now somehow being involved in Smith's murder. For years, Joseph III, the son of the prophet, had been courted to head the reorganization, which he turned down until March of 1860. Joseph III described the events years later. During the year 1859, the question of my connection with my father's work was finally determined. I became satisfied that it was my duty. In the winter, I resolved to put myself in communication with the brethren of the reorganized church. In accordance with this resolution, I wrote to Elder William Marks, announcing my intention to make the effort to take up the work left by my father. While there were many people that he could have written to, including the church body as a whole, he chose to write to Marks. He wrote Marks and stated, quote, "I am soon going to take my father's place at the head of the Mormon church, and I wish that you and some others, those you may consider the most trustworthy, the nearest to you, to come and see me." So he showed again a huge confidence in William Marks. And so William Marks went to Joseph III and he joined their group. On April 6, 1860, Marks ordained Joseph III as leader of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. 3 years later, Marks was called and ordained as a counselor in the First Presidency of the reorganization to offer counsel and help lead the people. He served in this role until his death in 1872. In Mark's obituary, written by Joseph III, it was written, "Brother Marks was the noblest of men. He has lived a life of most singular usefulness to his fellow men. Kind and upright in thought, it was known of him that his acts were founded in consciousness of right, and what was wrong to him he would not do." That final line, "what was wrong to him he would not do," was the guiding principle that sustained him while he went from one Joseph to the other. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for that fascinating lecture on William Marks. There is still so much to learn, and I can't wait until we're all able to get our hands on the book that you and Cheryl are writing. I don't think you can learn enough about William Marks, and I'm thrilled you and Cheryl are doing this research to share more details about Marks's story. So thank you so much.
All right, and thank you. It really was an honor.
We hope to have you back in one of our winter book series once that book is out and all of us can read it. Also, a big thank you to Peter and Lexi for helping out behind the scenes and making everything look so easy. And last, we share our thanks to all of you in the audience for coming out tonight and joining us and for continuing to read church history. Thank you so much for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. Now, I encourage you all to tune in 2 weeks as we gather again to welcome Kristen McKay to the Fall Lecture Series. As I mentioned earlier, Kristen will share with us all the fascinating details behind RLDS President Frederick Madison Smith's time living in Utah in 1904 through 1906. It's a lecture you don't want to miss, so follow the link that Lexi dropped into the chat to register for the lecture happening on Thursday, November 9th at 7 p.m. So remember, in 2 weeks, you heard that right. We're taking a church history break next Thursday, and we'll gather again with Kristen on November 9th. So Until then, friends, keep reading your church history. Take care and have a great, great night.